Cool, man. All right, man. It's January of 2021. It's our first Satsang for the year, and we're changing it a little bit over the next 6 months. I'm in the process of finishing my book now called Pointers to Awakening, and so I'll be doing these only once a month for the next few months. Once the book's done being written, I may open it back up to twice a month, but it'll be the third Thursday of every month at 6 o'clock California time. And then there's also a European satsang, which is at noon on California time on the fourth Friday. Now, the real quirky thing is that this is the only month I've ever seen where today is the third Thursday and tomorrow is the fourth Friday. So I'm actually on it. I'm actually on at noon again tomorrow with the European for the European time zone. So it ended up being back to back. Normally they're a week off because the third Thursday and the fourth Friday don't fall next to each other. But this month they did. So anyway, we've had a lot go on, and it's kind of for me, it's kind of a really cool situation because hold on a sec here. I got to get the do not disturb sign. So anyway, what I've noticed is that we've had a lot of endings in this last month, if you will, and so I wanted to just spend a few minutes and talk about awakening and death. So if you think about death for a minute, the way that we normally handle death is that we believe that we are a story. We've been taught that since we were children. We've talked about that a lot, about how you're conditioned, and your initial conditioning is to believe that I always say you're a separate and autonomous author of your own journey, but forget the autonomous piece for a minute because that's not really important here. But what is important is that you're a story that begins. So a story that has a beginning, of course, is going to be a story that has an ending. And if you stop for a minute and think, the only place where you can have beginnings and endings is where there's separation. So in duality, we see beginnings and we see endings, and we believe that we as consciousness or as pure awareness are going to have the same beginning and the same ending because we're looking out on a world that has obvious beginnings and endings to us, and we relate to those beginnings and we relate to those endings. And the way we see ourselves is as a story. So I'm Alan, I'm Donovan, I'm Justine, I'm James, I'm from pick a spot. I was born at, and that born at time is your beginning. You recite that for the rest of your life. I was born in Oakland on May 16th, 1953. That's the beginning of the Alan story. I was raised in California, so that's part of the Alan story. My mother converted to Mormonism, so Mormonism is part of the Allen story. I was a businessman, part of the Allen story. I went to India, part of the Allen story. So all of these things attach to a story that has a beginning. And then it doesn't take a PhD to figure out that Allen as a beginning and as a story is going to end. Now, how significant is a story? This is one way to look at it when you start to think about death. One of the things I'm really fond of is I will go out onto YouTube and I'll find these things about prehistory. So I really love the Iron Age and the Bronze Age and all of the big tall stones that you see at Stonehenge in these different places. And what I always notice is you will find actual civilizations, and there will be thousands upon thousands and thousands of skeletons and skulls and everything. And we literally know nothing about that civilization. We don't know their language. There's one in Turkey called Göbekli Tepe, which is about 8,000 BC. And there are carvings. They had a language. So there was actually symbols. There's animals that they carved. It was a city of about 50 to 100,000 people, or a gathering place of that size. And so when you start to look at the bones and the skulls and everything, you know that every single one of those was a story. Now, we don't know one thing about those stories. So once the story is over, it goes on the story scrap heap and eventually it disappears. Now, I go back into prehistory, 8,000 BC, but think about your own life. You could probably remember back to your grandfather and your grandmother. Did you know their grandfather or their grandmother? Do you know their names? Do you know where they're from? Do you know what their story was? How about their grandmother or grandfather? And that's only a few back, right? That's within a couple of 100 years. And already those stories are on the scrap heap. They're gone. They've disappeared. So when you stop for a minute and think, you know that when you inquire as to yourself, that there's something more to this being alive than a beginning and an ending. There's an intuition that tells you that. It's not really a difficult thing to figure out. So where do you put that? You know, where do you put that bit of knowledge? So one of the ways to look at this is to say, oh, I know that I was before my story birth, and I know that I will be after my story death. And when that understanding starts to arise, then what you're also going to get is a relaxation and a dropping of fear. What's the fear about? The fear is about, I'm going to die. The number one fear, all fears are based on the fact that you're going to die. At least that's what the psychologists would tell us. And I'm one that actually would buy into that. I think that's probably a pretty true statement, that the fear of death is the number one fear that we carry around with us. It's the one we worry about the most. It's the one we prepare for the most. It's the one that we get concerned about the most. If you look at the rituals that we have as human beings, we've actually, in a certain way, aggrandized, made bigger death, because what we do is when death happens, we gather everybody, and then we commingle ourselves with fear, and we express grief, and we express all of the things that we express. We make it bigger than it is. We really locate on top of that fact that story has ended. Now, I'm not saying that grief isn't something that might naturally arise. I think it's human to be sad when a story ends. You know, when it's heartbreaking for me when one of my dogs passes away. It's a story ending, and story endings are things that do bring up a feeling that you are sad that the story has ended, because engaging in life in front of you, in the story life itself, is a lot of fun. It's vibrant, it's exciting. We're human. Humanity engages in that. But then understanding that the ending is something that once the grief has occurred, that it rises and it falls, because underneath there's an understanding that you always are. What you are is consciousness and pure awareness itself. That's what you are. So the feeling that I exist, that very feeling, is something that always has followed you. You don't remember it having a beginning, and you won't remember it likely having an end. It always is. Here and now always is. All right. So all I wanted to do was just kind of address that, because what I notice is that, take the election, for example. In our country, the election was fairly close. Very close to half of our population voted for the person that lost. And last time, when the half of the population voted for the person that lost, there was intense grieving over that loss. That was Hillary Clinton. This time it's Donald Trump. And I find it fascinating that the winners seem to be on an assault kind of mission relative to the losers. and the losers are grieving as though the world is entirely over. And so there's a reflection of how we relate to death, how we relate to those endings. Now, last time it was the reverse. The group that's sad and upset this time was the group that was happy last time. And I just find it fascinating that humans can't stop and say, oh, we had a story death. Let's let the grieving in the moment pass. And we all know that we're here permanently, right? We are all the same thing. There is no such thing as a separate entity other than in the story. We hold those stories in our head. The separate bodies are just extensions of the same consciousness. In every single situation, we are the same thing. But we don't bring that understanding into play when these endings happen. And so we kind of pound into our consciousness that I can end, I can end, I can end. Look, this presidency just ended, and look at the sadness and grief that's surrounding that. And then the happiness about the new beginning, but in 4 or 8 years, that one's going to end as well. So we kind of already know the story here. We know the story of all of those dead skeletons and skulls in places that we never even knew the society. We don't even know our great grandfather and grandmother, right? But we know the story. They had a story ending, a story beginning, and a story ending. We already know all of that. We don't know what the story was, but we know that it happened. Humanity has always, lived in exactly that. I tell the story of the allegory of the cave sometimes about how Plato has this man that goes down into the cave, and among everybody else, he has a fixed view of the shadows on the wall, and he begins to believe that that's reality, right? And at one point in time, he gets freed, and he actually goes outside and sees what reality really is. So that's 2,500 years ago that story was told. So humans already knew that we had a beginning of a story and an ending of a story, and that we located a certain way around those beginnings and that ending and those endings, and that we identify with those. We believe that's what we are. So that's the basic stance that we have. And we also know that for thousands of years, somebody's looked at that and said, I think there's something wrong here. So the question is, do you have the courage to step into life knowing that there's something wrong with the way we hold ourselves, and also knowing that you always were and always will be, as a possibility, as a living understanding of who you are? It's in that courage that that the shift that's possible can be made, and understanding that what you are is consciousness and awareness itself, and that what it does is it produces what looks like a separate entity, and then we grab onto it and make that story up. So as you go through, start to notice that we were just talking about COVID, and we have a whole variety of deaths now. In the United States, we're at about 400,000 deaths here in January of 2021. And we're starting to see people that we know, a lot of us that are passing, and we're watching the country grieve about that as well. So endings are a very, very prominent piece of our story life right now. And so the reason I brought it up is to point to the fact that one can have a different story about beginnings and endings. You can start with a different story. I know I'm not the guy who's chained to that stone bench looking at that wall. I know those shadows I'm seeing are not the story that's really happening, even though the entirety of my society and culture will tell you that that's what's going on. But I know there's a different story. And can you step in knowing that story? Now, sometimes people will tell me, hey, Alan, I forget that story, right? In other words, when the first starts to fly, I forget that story. And my response to that is, don't worry about it, right? when it comes to you that there's a different story that you can employ it. When it's not present, that's the story that's there, don't worry. You know about the story of consciousness and awareness and awakening, right? The entire spiritual journey is one of dealing with mistaken identity. That's the entirety of the journey that we're on. And so spiritual seekers are simply people that in their intuition, they know that something's wrong with what the story is that they've seen. And in fact, they start to doubt that story is even what real life is. And so they go looking. Now, seekers don't know what they're looking for, right? I know that's the funniest thing, right? It's when you become a seeker, Osho used to tell this story about seekers. It's one of my favorite. He'd say, when you're a seeker, here's how it works. He says, you know that something's wrong. And so he says, as a seeker, you start to get closer and closer to this big abyss. And he says, and you look down and you can see that it's bottomless. It's a bottomless abyss. And he said, and finally, you can't help yourself and you jump. And now you're a spiritual seeker and you're basically hurtling through the air in a bottomless abyss with no idea where you're going. None. And he said, so what do you do? What do seekers do? And his answer was, well, as you hurtle through air, you're likely going to pass a few other people that have jumped off the same ledge. He says, just look at them and give them a smile and go, so far, so good. That's how you handle the spiritual journey. So far, so good. I'm hurtling through air. So far, so good. So seeking is kind of a backwards thing from a human standpoint. Usually when we seeking almost implies that we know what we're looking for. Very few people say, hey, I'm going to go out and I'm going to go seek. I have no idea what I'm looking for. That's a rare combination. But that's what the spiritual journey is. It is an act of human movement in consciousness that really has no destination. And so when you recognize that it's pure intuition, and in fact, the consciousness and awareness that you are, it lives in the state before intellect. So you can't even really intellectualize it. The minute that you say something about it, you've actually placed it into an intellectual platform where it's bounded and defined, and where you're headed isn't bounded and defined, right? And look how silly language is. So I say it isn't bounded and defined, and by saying that, I actually eliminate what I was pointing to, right? Because if it isn't that, then what is it, right? So even when we use the words and the intellect, it doesn't, the story, all that is a story. Everything in intellect is a story. And who you are is an actual sense, right? So when Nisargadatta said, my master told me to just go sit and be in the I am, and all the I am is the sense that you have that you exist. Now, what's interesting about that sense is that in that sense, there's no sense of time, right? And there's no sense of space. Isn't that funny? The stuff that makes duality and story work, time and space, really doesn't exist here and now. There is no internal sense of time here and now. There is no internal sense of space here and now. They don't exist. They only exist in your mind, right? One of my favorite things is to watch the physicists talk about what time is, right? So what is time? Think about it for a second. I would propose to you that time doesn't exist. When you sit here and now, there's absolutely no sense that anything started or anything is ending. There's no sense of any movement, right? So the time is simply duration, and the only place that duration exists is in the mind, right? Because when you sit here and now, there is no sense of anything called duration. There's just pure here and now. And it always feels exactly the same. It's the I am, right? The I am is pure awareness. It feels exactly the same. Do you remember when you were 5 and now you remember when you're, 40, 50, 60, whatever the age is? There's a part of you that's exactly the same right now as that was there when you were 5. We all know that. You can talk to anybody. You remember when you were 5 and you were present at something, and now you're 45 and you're present at something. Was there a difference in those 2 moments of being present? Just being there. Feel that you were there. And they go, no, there's a part of me that's always been exactly what it is. It's always the same. It's here, it's now. It's not old, it's not young, it's not anything. It has no sense of time, it has no sense of space. And that's where Nisargadatta's guru told him to go hang out. Go hang out in that space. Right? Go be in that space. And that's what he did. That was his way home. Now, for us, we talk about story being in a world that is a created world in our intellect and how we think that's what we are. And then we look at what we aren't. And when you look at what we aren't, you're actually looking at what you are, if you will, because your identification is not there. But what you are is exactly that essence, that presence, that sense of I am that's always there, always has been. You have no recollection of it beginning. Does anybody remember when it started? I don't know. I've asked that question a million times. I have yet to say somebody goes, yeah, it started on, give me a date. No, but it's always there. It was there before and it'll be there after. That's who you are. So think about what that does to fear, right? No beginning, no end. What happens to fear? Well, what's to fear? If what you are is what you've always been and what you will always be, right? And there's no story that goes with that. All you have to do is sit in what it is. Seems like you shouldn't be. It seems like the fear is just one of the story ending. And the story will end. And I guess that will be sad for a moment. But trust me, your great, great, great grandchildren will likely not even know the story's name. They won't know the story's experience. They're not going to know anything, right? You're going to be some dude that was in their family tree. They might someday see your name. But that's the relevance of a story when you compare it to who you really are. So that's death in a nutshell. I thought that would be fun. Isn't that great? First meeting of the year, and we're going to talk about death. I mean, you guys should feel incredibly uplifted that we started out that way. And so that's what it is. Anyway, I don't see any questions out here today. If there are any, drop them in as we go along, and we'll jump in that. Recently, somebody I like to look at the stories that tell us about how we as a society make up what life is and believe that's what it is and identify with it. So this week I was working on my book, and my editor asked me what my grandfather's favorite story was. Now, it's funny, his favorite story is an old classic, and you guys I know have all heard it. It's called The Emperor's New Clothes. And so, it turns out that in a land far, far away and before a time that we would recognize, there was this kingdom, and in this kingdom there lived a king, and he was quite a dandy, it turns out. He had what he thought was kind of the finest taste that there was. So when it came to food, when it came to whatever, he was a king that wanted to always express himself at the highest possible level. And he always believed that he had a palate and a view on life that was higher than anyone else's. He was that fine of a human being. And so, as luck would have it, he lived in this city that was in the middle of his kingdom, and it was a very busy city. Cobblestone, carts going in and out, markets were happening. So busy city. So he was a king of a busy city. And not only was his palace beautiful and all of the places that he lived beautiful, But what he had that was really cool was he loved his apparel. He loved his clothes, and he could walk around and let everybody see it, right? So, so the bottom line is that um, at one point in time, there appeared this man who was a designer and tailor, and he was thought to be magical. He was so magical that people would say, unless you have just the perfect eyes and the perfect sensibilities, oftentimes you cannot even see his designs and you can't even see what he's working on. So, of course, the king was very, very taken by that. And he said, well, we got to get that guy in here. And so, of course, they went out and they found that tailor. And, and the tailor and designer brought his sketches in. And if this would have been a time in our time, you would have been hearing, names like Versace and all of those, Dior and all of those famous names. I mean, so this designer and this tailor was in that, magical realm, probably one above that even. So he brought his sketchbook in and he showed them the sketchbook, and everybody gathered around, counselors and everything. And many of them, they just kind of kept their mouth shut because when they looked at the paper, they couldn't see a damn thing. It looked blank to them. But of course, they didn't want to mention it in front of the king because they would immediately be dubbed as somebody without the fine, without this fine sense of what's going on. Now, I want you to listen to that part, because in humanity, a lot of times, if you don't have the fine sensibilities that you need to have, then you're afraid to say anything about it. So people will a lot of times not even talk about the obvious. So here's the sketches. Nobody saw anything. And of course, the king approved them immediately, said, those are the most beautiful clothes I've ever seen, sent him out, and they would go visit the workshop. And when they would go by the workshop, the counselors and the people, the king's entourage would look at it, and most everybody it would look to them like that the thread was invisible and the cloth was invisible, and all there was this kind of bodice that was used in order to hang the clothes on that more or less resembled the king in terms of size and everything else, the kind of thing a tailor and a designer would use. But of course, again, nobody said anything. Now, the king was pretty excited about his new clothes. And so in this particular case, he decided to designate a day, and he was going to have a parade through his city. And that day came. And of course, the market carts were parked outside, no traffic allowed in the city. The market was shut down, and all of the citizens were supposed to be there for the parade. I know you all heard this before. But anyway, the parade happens. Now, it was normal, right? The young people were scurrying around. The adults were holding the hands of the very smallest ones. The elderly were in their walkers or in their chairs. And of course, all of the things that you would see in a normal parade. So the king started down the street. And as he did, there was this young 5-year-old boy sitting on the shoulders of his dad, like you would normally see. And upon seeing the king, he couldn't help himself, and he gushed out and he said, "Hey, Dad, that king, he's got no clothes on." And in that moment, something clicked in the entire kingdom. Now, we don't know how the story ended. We don't know if the king ran terrified back to his palace. We don't know if he continued on in his full nude regalia and pretended that everything was okay. We don't know how the story ended. But we do know that story got told time and time again, and exists into today's story world, as much like Plato's cave, as a point of, do you see that what we believe and what we're told is out there may very well not be there, right? So humanity has been onto this. There's story after story after story. Now, my grandfather, the reason he would tell me that, he couldn't elaborate on all of the spiritual extensions. He didn't. I was probably 4 or 5 years old when I first heard that story. But what Grandpa did was he taught us, and taught me particularly, to always take a very deep look at every story and to ask yourself, are there really any clothes there? Is there a there there? That became a watchword. And in my family, um, if grandpa or I said, well, maybe they have no clothes, people would just roll their eyes because they heard that so often, I think. But um, he used to have a little nickname for me. I didn't like my name. And so we used to, I liked the name Chuck, I guess, when I was about 4 years old. So grandpa would call me Chuck. Now, he never told anybody why, and I didn't either, but that was what he called me. And, uh, and so when we would talk about something, often grandpa would say, now, Chuck, what's in there that we're not seeing? What's the assumption that's being made? Every time you look at something, what's the assumption? Right? So you notice I use that all the time when somebody asks me a question. Is there an assumption in the question that once dissolved releases the question itself? So rather than looking for an answer to the question, what the exercise is dissolving the concept of the story itself, the assumption that we make about it. So what's the assumption that we make when we talk about death? We assume there's a beginning and we assume there's an end. And when we actually talk about it, we can see we may not even know for certain that's not true, but we certainly know that that assumption is not warranted because there's enough other things to go, hey, wait a minute. I have an experience that says I've always been and I always will be. I have an experience that's timeless. So looking for the assumptions in the depth, that has always been the watchword on the spiritual path. So that's that. So there are my stories for today. I don't know. I got excited because I got to revisit. I hadn't really thought about it in a lot of years. The Emperor's New Clothes. Isn't that funny? An old standard. If it were jazz music, it'd be The Sentimental Journey. I mean, this is like The Emperor's New Clothes. That's such a classic, but it's such an important story. All right, I got a direct message from James, and I'm gonna read. If it's okay with you, James, I'm just gonna read this because I think this is kind of an interesting thing. Is there any evidence that the Egyptians were a nation of seekers? Now, I think there absolutely is. The beauty about the Egyptians particularly is that if you look at the, what would you call them? Are they the frescoes or the kind of art displays? And they're more than art because they were religiously instructive, and they would have these plates and they would be within their temples. And they were very, very concerned, and they would locate on what happens in the afterlife, right? So they wanted to have a story that extended beyond the ending of death. So whenever you see that, and whenever you see a lot of story around that, then you have someone who's acting on a suspicion that something isn't right with the idea that there's an ending. And so what they do is they take the story and they extend it. So the only difference, because if you can extend the story, remember I grew up as a Mormon. So the Mormon version of that is that you die and you become a celestial being, right? Much like the being that you are now, except for celestialized. So you're going to be rendered in bright white light, or whatever it is that conception is, and you will live eternally. So the way that we deal with that is by extending the story. Right now, some people will go back and extend the story backwards as well. If you look at the Indian culture, they talk about the rebirth and rebirth and rebirth, right? So they extend the story for lifetime, 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 and then in their kind of world, the story drops and you become eternal. So after enough lifetimes, you become enlightened. Well, their version of enlightenment, if you think about it, is not the one I'm talking about, where you recognize yourself as the same thing that everyone else is, and all there is consciousness. Their idea is that the story that you are becomes enlightened, and upon enlightenment, that you will continue to march into some eternity as an enlightened story. And so, whenever you see extended stories, either going back or going forward, it's the attempt by humans to recognize the feeling and the intuition that they have that they're eternal, that they are pure awareness. But rather than seeing that the story is held in the intellect only and that you always are that, that's what the simple inquiry as to who am I leads to Ramana Maharshi, or as I say, Nisargadatta would say, sit on the I am. Ramesh Balsekar would have you take a look at whether you were actually in charge of things, and you could see that you aren't. And so you started to go, oh, I'm just lived into the moment. And so I make up a story about that, but actually everything is happening by itself. And so all of these people had a way of pointing to the fact that you are always and eternally the same thing. But the Egyptians were clearly a nation of seekers. Now, did they have the mystics in the Egyptian world? I suspect they did. We don't have, to my knowledge, we don't have enough writing and enough philosophy from the Egyptians that survived that would tell us that that was the case. But certainly in the Hindu world, and remember that the Hindu world and the Egyptian world were kind of running side by side. So they had huge influences on each other. So I would say you would have to almost suspect that there was the mystical tradition within the Egyptian religion. And as replete as it is, the Egyptians had their Book of the Dead, similar to the Tibetans, a different version, but the same kind of thing. So these traditions had a lot of work done that you and I would call religion, but you would have to think that there was a mystical tradition, that went along with that. And certainly in all the modern religions that we see today, we can find those mystical traditions. We can find that, in the Jewish kinds of writings. We can find that in the Islamic writings. We can find that in the Hindu writings. Those we have had surviving pieces that say that they were seekers. It seems to me, if you sense that existence is always a cobbling of kind of the same thing, so the only difference between us and the Egyptians is that we have Western stories told in our language versus Egyptian stories told in theirs, that in that world that there would have been a mystical tradition of awakening, that was something that happened then. Buddha, of course, was 500 BC-ish. The Upanishads, I think, were back. Some people think that they were back in the 8 to 10,000 BC range, and they clearly pointed to an awakening experience, a tangible awakening. So those pieces are out there. So I would say, yeah, there's evidence, and you can certainly walk into that. I hope that helps, by the way, James. I don't know if it does or doesn't, but that's my shot at that one. So great. So what I'll do is I'm going to have it be a little short today. It's been pretty loaded today. But so here's the thing. Remember, as you go along, that the journey is one of a mistaken identity. What you think you are as a story is what you hold intellectually in order to understand you as a separate story. That's what your intellect does. It holds everything in separation. That's its job, right? Underneath intellect is what feeds intellect, what intellect grows out of. All of the individuations, all of the separations stand on top of exactly the same thing and are only extensions of that. So it's only in your imagination that you are in any way or form separate and autonomous. And it is in the here and now, in the sense of I am, that a knowing can arise that that is not the case. That you're always here, you're always now, and that that begins to accompany you in every moment. Now, the beauty of that is that stories have ups and downs, so they're turbulent by nature. Separation is turbulent by nature. Absolute prior unity and absolute awareness are not. So think about the who you are when you were 5 and the who you are when you're 45. Absolutely the same thing. Not even a blip in the water. So I just want everybody to understand that's where to go when you're dealing with the turbulence of the outside and the beginnings and the endings of the outside. You already are absolute permanent peace, and you can go there whenever you'd like. So Donovan, the kingdom of heaven is within. Is that the same meaning? Yes. Yes. Now, the beauty of Christ, if you notice what he did, because he spoke in parables. So, and all of us tend to have a Christian background. I had a friend that used to say it comes in your mother's milk. So Christianity kind of is what we do. But what was beautiful about the parables, if you think about it, they always meet you where you are. And the reason that they do that is because the meaning can be whatever it needs to be at wherever you are on your journey. But at the very bottom, it's always going to be exactly what we're talking about now. So at first you go outside and you search for things, right? You go to libraries, you think this means something. You look to the outside to find meaning. The entire world right now is looking to the outside to go, oh my God, how can we create a better world? And what happens is the world always holds the good, the bad, and the in-between. So it in a certain way, it never really changes. But in anyone's life, it's turbulent. It's up, it's down, and it's in between. So where do you get sent when you start your spiritual journey? To the inside. What's on the inside? Absolute, pure awareness, which is what you are, which never changes. Any turbulence there? So one of the fun things to do is to go back. Remember when you were 5 and you were just watching something. Remember when you're now 45 or 68 or whatever you are. Pick your number and feel what that experience was like, and you're going to find out. Oh, I was there in exactly the same way I am now. It's just being there. It's just being. It's just here and now. So your mind can remember that. So you know that's true. And when you're there, there's no turbulence, none whatsoever. And it really is that simple. That's who you really are, is that. Right? And that's why they use the term that, by the way, Donovan, just as an extra, because that's a way of pointing to something but saying nothing at all. So because when you describe it, you make it part of the up and down, right? So the best we could come up with is that. Just as a cute little story to end, if you remember, Nisargadatta was famous for writing a book, I Am That. And one day they were asking him about that, and he says, well, he said, that's an overstatement. He said, really, there's no I. And he said, and there is no that. And he said, but my publishers told me that a book titled Am just wouldn't sell. So that's where we get I Am That. It's got 2 extra words in there. The title should have been Am. He would have been famous for writing the book called Am. So according to him. So anyway, well, thank you, everybody. I will be back on in a month. If you're tomorrow, we'll do it. Actually, next month it'll be 3rd and 4th again. Always the same link, by the way. Keep this link. And I love you all. Thank you for dropping in. And I will have this recorded and out. Okay. Much love. Bye.